Chamber music fades. 140 guests fall silent. Paige rises from her seat mid-dinner, her voice unnervingly calm. "I'm sorry to interrupt," holds eye contact across the room Douglas. "You're going to be a father." The entire room stops breathing. Douglas doesn't look at Paige, he looks straight at his wife. Caroline, a smile that never reaches her eyes, she picks up her fork, continues eating. Her hands don't tremble once. 3 a.m., the kitchen is dark. Renata slides a file across the table, voice low. This pregnancy wasn't an accident. This was planned 18 months ago, and he never signed consent for this transfer. Caroline, eyes sharp, each word deliberate and cold. So then, who was actually the one being played in that room that night? One gala dinner. One announcement that shattered the air. But the wife sat there perfectly still, fork in hand, because she already knew the truth was far heavier than anything in that room. Watch now to see how Caroline dismantles the entire game in a way no one saw coming. The smell hit her first. Gardenias, heavy and sweet and slightly too much, the way gardenias always are when someone has ordered too many of them for a room this size. Caroline Whitfield stepped through the double doors of the Hartley Foundation's annual gala and registered the scent before she registered anything else. 140 guests, crystal glassware catching light from 3 enormous chandeliers, centerpieces that had cost more than most people's car payments, and the string quartet in the corner playing something she almost recognized but could not name. She was wearing the midnight blue dress. Douglas had told her to wear the red one. He had said it twice that afternoon, standing in the doorway of their bedroom, and she had nodded as though she agreed. Then she had reached past the red dress and taken out the blue one instead. She had not thought about why. She knew now that some part of her had understood something her conscious mind was still refusing to accept. "You look thin," said Patricia Hensley, appearing from the left and grasping Caroline's forearm too tightly. "Are you sleeping?" "Like a baby," Caroline said. She meant it as a joke. It did not land as one. Patricia's eyes said something her mouth did not. Caroline filed it away and kept moving. She was good at this. Moving through rooms like this was something she had been doing for 17 years. She had developed a private architecture for it. Track Douglas with her peripheral vision. Register who was talking to him and how close they were standing. Smile at the right moments. Remember names. Ask about children. Remember which ones had just graduated, which ones had just gotten engaged, which ones had quietly left for rehab and come back. She was extraordinary at this. She had never decided whether that was something to be proud of. Douglas was across the room, near the bar, laughing at something a man in a charcoal suit had said. His hand was on the man's shoulder. It was the big laugh, the room laugh, the one he used when the person he was laughing with had money he wanted access to. She had learned to read his laughs the way a musician learns to read a score. Arthur Brennan stood about 6 feet away from Douglas, holding a glass of sparkling water and looking slightly stiff. Arthur was always slightly stiff these days. She had noticed that over the past several months without attaching a reason to it. The dinner was called. Place cards. Third table from the stage, which was where the respected but not crucial guests were seated. Douglas was at the head table. Standard. Caroline sat between a woman named Frances who ran a pediatric hospital wing and a man named Gerald who had opinions about property tax reform. She talked to both of them with genuine interest. She asked Frances about a new neurological unit. She asked Gerald about legislation she had actually read. She ate the salad. She complimented the sommelier on his selection. She was, in all observable ways, entirely fine. The soup course came. She finished it. The main course arrived. And then Paige Holloway stood up. She did not clink her glass. She did not ask for the room's attention in any conventional way. She simply stood. The table nearest to her went quiet first, the way a crowd goes quiet when something shifts in the air and the body registers it before the mind does. Then the quiet spread outward like rings on still water. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Paige said. She was not sorry. Caroline heard that immediately. The apology was in the words and not in the voice. Paige Holloway was 31 years old. She was Douglas's events coordinator, which was a title that meant she organized things for him, traveled with him, and had access to his calendar. She was beautiful in a way that required significant effort and the discipline to make that effort invisible. She had dark hair and a composure that Caroline recognized as practiced. You did not achieve that kind of composure naturally. You built it, brick by brick. "I have an announcement," Paige said. Her voice did not waver. She had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it many times. And Douglas, she looked across the room. The pause was exactly 4 seconds long. Caroline would remember that later. Not 3, not 5, 4. "You should know," Paige said. "You're going to be a father." The room did not gasp. It did something quieter than that. It contracted. The air in the room seemed to pull toward the center of the announcement, as though drawn by gravity. 140 people stopped talking, stopped chewing, stopped breathing in the same moment, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Caroline had heard in years. She did not move. She watched Douglas's right hand reach for his water glass. He did not look at Paige. He looked at Caroline. That was the thing she would carry with her for a long time afterward. Not the announcement, not the room, not even the silence. He looked at her first. And in his face, in the fraction of a second before he composed himself, she saw something she had been trying not to name for a very long time. She saw a man who had been dreading this exact moment. A man who had been living inside the knowledge of it while she had been living outside. He already knew. God, she thought, he already knew. She picked up her fork. She finished her salad. The action was automatic. Her hands knew what to do even when the rest of her did not. 17 years of public dinners had built a kind of muscle memory into her that operated independently of shock. She set the fork down when she was finished. She set it precisely parallel to the knife. Frances, beside her, had placed her hand gently on the table near Caroline's, not quite touching. It was a kind gesture. Caroline noticed it without being able to respond to it. The gala ended the way galas end. Speeches. A live auction that raised $460,000 for pediatric research. The string quartet played something she finally recognized as a Brahms intermezzo. People said goodbye. Some of them looked at her with expressions she would have found unbearable in other circumstances. She got through it. The car was a black town car, which meant there was a driver, which meant there would be no yelling. She had parked that realization away as something to be grateful for. They rode in silence for 7 minutes. Then Douglas said it. I was going to tell you. The words fell into the silence of the car and just sat there. Caroline looked out the window at the lights of the city moving past. She watched a woman walking a dog. She watched a yellow taxi make a turn. She watched the ordinary world doing its ordinary things while the interior of this car held the worst sentence her husband had ever spoken to her. Not because it was cruel, because it was true. He had been going to tell her. He had been going to tell her, which meant there was something to tell. He had been going to tell her on his own terms, in his own time, in a way that allowed him to manage it, and instead it had been taken out of his hands and placed at a dinner table in front of 140 people. She had been the last person in the room to know, except she had not been. That was the thing. That was the thing she was only beginning to understand as the car moved through the city. She had not been the last person to know. She had been the first person not to know. The distinction was important. You could be the last person to acknowledge something while being the first person to have seen it. She said nothing. The car reached the house. They went inside. The house was very quiet. Griffin was at his grandparents' place for the weekend, which was a small mercy Caroline had not understood she was going to need when she had made that arrangement 3 weeks ago. The house held only her and Douglas and the particular silence of a place that knew something had broken inside it. Douglas followed her upstairs. He was talking before they reached the landing. The words came in the shape of an apology, but without the substance of one. She heard them the way you hear traffic through a window. Present, recognizable, not quite reaching you. It happened, he said. It happened, and I know how that sounds, and I know that doesn't explain anything, but it wasn't supposed to go this far. It didn't mean what you think it means. I didn't know she was going to do what she did tonight. Caroline. She went into the bathroom. She closed the door. She sat down on the floor. She was wearing a $4,000 dress. The tile was cold through the silk. She sat with her back against the bathtub and her knees slightly bent, and she held her own hands in her lap. She did not cry. She was waiting for the crying. She had imagined it many times, without quite naming what she was imagining. The moment when the thing she had been refusing to know finally arrived fully formed. She had always thought it would arrive with screaming or throwing of things or some form of breaking. But the woman sitting on the bathroom floor in a $4,000 dress was very, very still. And the stillness frightened her more than the announcement had. He said something through the door. She did not respond. She had rehearsed a version of this conversation she understood now, not consciously. The way you rehearse things you tell yourself you are not rehearsing. She had imagined a version of herself that confronted him, that accused, that threw things with satisfying finality. She had imagined herself righteous and undeniable. The woman on the floor was neither of those things. I was so stupid, she thought. Then she corrected herself. No, not stupid. I chose not to know. There is a difference. And I need to understand that difference before I do anything else. She sat there for a long time. The cold of the tile through the silk was a specific and grounding sensation. She focused on it when other things became too large. Cold floor, silk dress, her own hands. She heard Douglas stop talking through the door. She heard him move to the bedroom. She heard, eventually, the specific silence of a person who has fallen asleep. She came out of the bathroom at 2 in the morning. He was on his side to the bed, still dressed, one arm across his eyes. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. She looked at him the way you look at something you are trying to memorize and also trying to understand. She had loved this man for 20 years, loved him specifically, with the kind of love that knows someone's small habits and the way they look when they are embarrassed and what they reach for when they are scared. She thought about all of that while she stood in the doorway. Then she went downstairs and made coffee. She sat at the kitchen island at 2 in the morning with her hands around a mug and the rest of the house dark around her. The streetlight came in through the kitchen window and made a rectangle of pale orange on the counter. She stared at it. She said something then, aloud to no one. "I'm not crazy," she said. "I knew what I saw. I just kept deciding it meant something else." The words sat in the dark kitchen for a moment. She meant them. She meant them in the specific way of a woman who has spent years being told, in 1,000 indirect ways, that her perceptions were slightly off. Not by screaming, not by anything dramatic, just by the small daily accumulation of being managed, of having her concerns redirected, of being given explanations that were technically possible but which she had never quite believed. She opened her laptop. She typed 2 names into the search bar. She looked at what she had typed. She closed the laptop without pressing search. She was not ready for that yet. She knew she would be soon. She found Douglas's phone on the counter near the coffee maker. She had not gone looking for it. It was just there. It lit up as she moved past it, the way phones do when they detect motion. She stopped. She did not pick it up. She read the notification from this distance. Page, 47 messages. She stood there for a moment. Then she went and reorganized the pantry. She alphabetized the spices. She moved the canned goods so that they were grouped by category. She threw away 4 things that had expired. She wiped down the shelves with a cloth and then wiped them again. She worked quietly and methodically in the dark kitchen while the rest of the house slept, and the rectangle of streetlight moved slowly across the counter as the hours passed. Her phone rang at 2:45 in the morning. She looked at the screen. Renata. "Tell me you're okay," Renata said when she answered. "I'm organizing the spice rack alphabetically," Caroline said. There was a pause. "Okay," Renata said. "I'm coming over." "No, don't," Caroline said. "It's almost 3 in the morning. I'm already in the car," Renata said. Renata. "I've been watching my phone since the first text went around at 9:45, Renata said. Her voice was steady and careful. "I have been sitting in my kitchen for 4 hours waiting for you to call. I'm already in the car." Caroline looked at the spice rack, at the alphabetical order she had imposed on it. "The door's unlocked," she said. Renata Hargrove arrived at 3 in the morning with a bottle of good bourbon and the expression of a woman who had been waiting 3 years to have a particular conversation. She was 46 years old and Caroline's best friend and also a family law attorney. Caroline had spent their entire friendship being grateful for the first thing and carefully not using the second thing. Tonight those 2 versions of Renata were going to collide, and there was nothing left to do about that. She set the bourbon on the kitchen island. She found 2 glasses without being told where they were. She poured. Douglas was still upstairs. They did not speak about that. Renata sat across from Caroline and looked at her with the specific attention of a person who is assessing rather than simply observing. "How long have you known?" Caroline asked. Renata's silence was exactly half a second too long. "Renata, I didn't know," Renata said carefully. "I suspected. There is a difference, and I chose to believe in that difference because you seemed happy, or you seemed content, or I needed to believe you were. How long have you suspected?" Renata picked up her glass. "Set it down. About 3 years," she said. Caroline went very still. 3 years. 3 years ago, Griffin had been 13. 3 years ago, she and Douglas had taken a trip to Portugal for their 14th anniversary. She had a framed photograph from that trip on her desk at the nonprofit. Douglas on a dock in the Alentejo light, looking younger than he was, laughing at something just outside the frame. She had always loved that photograph. 3 years ago, she had been nominated for a nonprofit leadership award. Douglas had given a speech at the ceremony. She could hear it even now, the specific warmth of his voice, the way he had looked at her across the room while he said the words. "She is the most remarkable woman I have ever known." She had believed him completely. The memories did not come sentimentally. They came as evidence. She began cataloging them. The conference in Dallas he had attended alone when she had offered to come, and he had said it was boring and she would hate it. The weekend in February when his phone had gone to voicemail for 6 hours, and he had explained it away with bad signal at a client dinner. The way he had stopped picking fights with her around that time, which she had interpreted as growth and maturity, and even, privately, as the marriage entering a new and better phase. The gifts. The sudden resumption of gifts after years of not giving them. Oh, she thought, the gifts were guilt. She reached for her bourbon glass, set it back down without drinking, reached for it again, set it down again. The third time she let it sit. "I need to tell you something," Renata said, "and I need you to hear it before you talk to Douglas, before you make any decisions, before you do anything." She reached into her bag. She set her phone face up on the counter. I did something this week that I am technically not supposed to have done, Renata said. I want you to know that up front. I made some calls. I pulled something that is technically public record but that I accessed through a professional channel. She showed Caroline a photograph on her phone, a property filing. Standard document format, names and numbers and dates. Caroline read it. She read it again. Douglas bought a condo, she said. 12 months ago, Renata said. Not in your names. Not in his name directly. In the name of a company that is not connected to any of his documented business entities. That could mean any number of things, Caroline said. She heard herself say it. She recognized the reflex. Yes, Renata said. It could, but I want you to have the information before you decide what it means. He was building an exit, Caroline said quietly, not asking, understanding. Before she was pregnant, Renata said. He was already building an exit. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street. Its headlights swept briefly across the window and moved on. I thought he was absent, Caroline thought. He was present. He was present and pointed somewhere else. The particular hurt of that was different from anything she had expected to feel. It was not rage. It was not grief exactly. It was the specific and quiet devastation of being logistically erased while still physically in the room, of being planned around, of being something that needed to be managed and then exited from. She had been, for at least a year, a problem he was solving. There's something else, Renata said. She hesitated. That was unusual. Renata did not typically hesitate. About the pregnancy, she said. I don't know how to say this except directly. Then say it directly, Caroline said. Paige Holloway had a medical procedure 18 months ago, Renata said. I know this because she was briefly a client of mine, unrelated matter, and it came up incidentally. It was an IVF procedure. Caroline looked at her. Paige is 31, she said. I know, Renata said. Women have IVF at 31. It happens. It is not impossible. But the circumstances were specific. She underwent the procedure without a partner on record at the time. And the timing creates a question I think you need to sit with. What question? Caroline asked. If she had an embryo transferred, she controlled the timing of that entirely, Renata said. She controlled when it happened. She controlled when Douglas found out. She controlled when you found out. She paused, and she controlled that announcement tonight. Caroline sat with that. The bourbon glass was still untouched. You're saying the pregnancy may have been a strategy, she said. I'm saying the timeline creates a question, Renata said carefully. I'm not saying anything definitive. I'm saying that before you process this as a straightforward story of a cheating husband and an accidental pregnancy, you should know that there are details that don't quite fit that narrative. She used him, Caroline said. That's one possibility, Renata said, and he used me, Caroline said. So that makes everyone in this story someone who used someone else. Except you, Renata said. Except me, Caroline agreed. She picked up the bourbon glass. This time she drank it. Douglas came downstairs at 7 in the morning. Renata had left at 5:30. She had hugged Caroline at the door for a long moment without saying anything. Sometimes friendship is the absence of words. Sometimes it is the presence of a person who stays until almost dawn and then goes home so you can face the morning alone, without being alone for the part before it. Caroline was at the kitchen table when Douglas appeared. She had made 2 cups of coffee, one for herself, one placed across from her, already poured, already cooling slightly. She had been up all night. She did not look it. This was something she had learned from her mother. The art of being completely illegible when it mattered most. Her mother called it the good Irish face. The face that gave nothing away to people who had not earned the right to know what was behind it. Douglas sat down. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He looked at her. Caroline, he said. Tell me about Paige, she said. Start from the beginning. I want the actual beginning. He told her a version of the truth. She recognized it as a version because it was too smooth in some places and too vague in others. He had not sat up all night composing this account by accident. He had been shaping it since the car ride home, perhaps since the moment the announcement was made, perhaps since much earlier than that. She let him talk. She did not interrupt. This was deliberate. She had discovered over 17 years of marriage to a man who was professionally skilled at persuasion that silence was more effective than interruption. Interruption gave him something to respond to. Silence made him fill the space with things he had not planned to say. He said it happened gradually. He said it did not mean what she was probably thinking. He said he had not been planning to leave her. He said the pregnancy was something Paige had told him privately 2 weeks ago, and that last night's announcement had been something he had not anticipated and could not have stopped. Did she ambush you, Caroline said, or did you fail to act in 2 weeks? He stopped. She looked at him steadily. Those are different things, Douglas, she said. One of them means you were blindsided and powerless. The other means you had information and made a choice. Which is it? He was quiet for a moment. Both, he said finally. It's both. She nodded. She had known it was both. She had wanted to hear him say it. I'm going to ask you to give me the morning, she said. I need to think. I need you to be somewhere that is not this kitchen while I think. He went upstairs to shower. She walked outside. The back garden was still in the early morning. The flagstones were wet from the sprinkler that ran on an automatic timer at 5 in the morning. She walked to the center of the yard and stopped. She picked up a dead leaf from the flagstones. She turned it over in her hands. She set it on top of the garden wall. She stood there for 4 minutes. The neighbor's automatic sprinkler started 2 houses down, a soft hiss that she could hear in the stillness. The light was the particular light of 7 in the morning in late autumn, flat and honest and a little cold. She did not try to solve anything. She did not make any plans. She simply stood in her own garden and let the morning be the morning. Then she went back inside. Griffin was standing in the kitchen doorway. He was 16 years old and the most perceptive person she knew. He was not supposed to be home. He had come home early from his grandparents without calling ahead, which meant he had heard something, had sensed something, or had simply known the way young people sometimes know things before they are told them. He was wearing the gray sweatshirt he slept in. His hair was messy. He was trying very hard to look ordinary, Mom, he said. Are you and Dad getting divorced? She looked at her son. She had made herself a promise a long time ago. She had promised that she would never lie to him about important things. Small things, yes. The way every parent lies about small things to protect a child's sense of the world being basically manageable. But important things, no. I don't know yet, she said. But whatever happens, it will not be your fault, and you will not lose either of us. He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him process this. She watched him decide to trust her assessment enough to hold on to it. He nodded. He went upstairs. She heard his door close very quietly. He had not slammed it. He was trying so hard to be okay that the restraint of it broke her open completely, in a way the announcement had not, and the bathroom floor had not, and the bourbon at 3 in the morning had not. She stood in the kitchen. She let herself feel that for approximately 45 seconds. Then she picked up the phone. She called the nonprofit where she worked. She spoke to her assistant in the calm professional voice she used for difficult things. She requested 2 weeks of personal leave. She said it was a family matter. Her assistant said, of course, take whatever you need, and she said thank you and hung up. She went and sat in her car in the driveway. She did not go anywhere. She sat in the parked car in her own driveway and looked at the garage door for 22 minutes. The anger was there. She could feel it. Not the hot, explosive kind. The cold, precise kind. The kind that comes when you stop grieving and start asking different questions. This was not about heartbreak anymore. This was about truth. 3 days later, Caroline sat at the kitchen table with 37 pages in front of her. She had called a private investigator. Renata had referred him. She had not hired him to find proof of the affair. She had enough of that. She had hired him to answer one specific question. What was the actual financial picture of Douglas Whitfield's private assets? What she got back was 37 pages of answers. She read every one of them. There was the company that held the condo. She had already known about that one. But there were 2 other limited liability companies she had not known about. There was a retirement account structured in a way that was technically legal and practically designed to be difficult to locate in legal discovery. There were assets that had begun moving, quietly and carefully, over approximately 18 months, into protected structures. He did not panic and run, she thought. He planned. He had been methodical about it. He had moved slowly enough that no single transaction looked alarming. He had used different attorneys for different pieces. He had been careful. She highlighted passages with a yellow marker she had found in a kitchen drawer. She had not used a yellow marker since graduate school. She worked steadily through the document, pausing occasionally to make notes in the margin. This was not grief anymore. This was something cleaner than grief. I am not helpless, she thought. I have never been helpless. I chose to be helpless because the alternative required me to see things I was not ready to see. She was ready now. She called Renata. I need to know every option I have, she said when Renata picked up. And I need you to be ruthlessly honest, not my best friend honest, divorce attorney honest. That is the version of me you have been avoiding for 3 years, Renata said. I know, Caroline said. I am not avoiding it anymore. Renata arrived that afternoon. She brought a folder. She sat across from Caroline at the kitchen table, and they talked for 2 hours. She explained what the settlement process would look like. She explained what discovery would reveal. She explained what the 37-page report meant in the context of splitting assets in a legal separation agreement. She was very good at this. Caroline had always known she was very good at this. She had always found reasons not to see it in the context of her own life. She was done finding reasons. The phone rang while Renata was still there. Douglas's mother, Dorothy Whitfield, was 73 years old. She had always treated Caroline with the particular warmth that powerful men's families extend to useful daughters-in-law. It was not unkind. It was simply transactional in ways that had taken Caroline some time to understand. "I wanted to check on you, dear," Dorothy said when Caroline stepped away to take the call. "This is such a difficult situation for everyone." "It is," Caroline agreed. "Family is so complicated," Dorothy said. "And Douglas does work so hard. He always has. You know how he is. Men like him need," she paused. "Need what, Dorothy?" Caroline said. "I just mean that perhaps if things had been a little more—" Dorothy stopped and started again. "More present. At home. You have always been so devoted to your work, and that is wonderful, of course. But men need to feel that their home is a place they want to return to." Caroline looked at the wall. She took a breath. "Dorothy," she said, "I am going to stop you there. Not because I am angry at you. Because I understand you love your son and this is frightening for you. But I need to make a very important decision in the next several days, and I cannot make it clearly while also managing your feelings about it. I will call you next week." She hung up. She stood in the hallway for a moment. "Somewhere along the way," she said quietly, "to no one, I became invisible in this marriage. And I let that happen because I was afraid of what I would find if I looked too hard. But I am done being afraid of what is true," she said it out loud, to herself, in an empty hallway. It was one of the most important things she had ever said. She went back to the kitchen. Renata looked up. "Dorothy?" she asked. "Dorothy," Caroline confirmed. "The settlement will address that appropriately," Renata said. "I know it will," Caroline said. "Now show me the part about the limited liability companies again." Renata had gone home and Caroline was cleaning up the papers when her phone rang again. "I need to see you in person," Renata said without preamble. "Not on the phone." "Why not on the phone?" Caroline asked. "Because what I'm going to tell you changes the shape of everything," Renata said. "And I want to see your face when I say it." Renata came to the house the following evening. She brought files this time, not the property documents, something different. She sat at the kitchen table and she did not pour anything or offer any preamble. She simply opened the folder. "I did something I probably should not have done," she said. Again. "You keep doing things you should not have done," Caroline said. "Yes," Renata agreed. "I think that is what friendship actually looks like when things are serious." She had made a call. A colleague in the medical legal field, someone who worked at the intersection of reproductive law and patient advocacy. Not to access private medical records, never that, but to ask questions about a specific clinic and their protocols. "There is a reproductive endocrinologist named Dr. Fern Alcott," Renata said. "She has a practice in this city. She is well regarded in her field. She has also spoken publicly in the context of medical ethics conferences about the issue of consent in donor-assisted IVF procedures." Caroline was listening. "Condo Douglas purchased," Renata said. "It was bought 12 months ago. If Paige Holloway underwent her IVF procedure 18 months ago, that means there is a gap of 6 months between the procedure and the purchase." "He was still with her when he bought the condo," Caroline said. "He was apparently planning to leave her at some point," Renata said carefully. "But here is what is important. If the procedure 18 months ago involved creating embryos at that time, those embryos could have been stored, transferred at any point afterward." Caroline went very still. She saw it. She controlled when it happened, she said. She could have waited. She could have chosen the moment. "Yes," Renata said. "And there is a further question. In the context of IVF, when embryos are created, both parties sign consent forms at multiple stages. There is typically a consent for the original collection, and there is a separate consent required at the time of the actual transfer. Meaning," Caroline said, "meaning it is legally and procedurally possible," Renata said carefully, "for a transfer to occur without the documented consent of the genetic donor. If forms were altered, if an original general consent was used to authorize a procedure it was not intended to cover, if someone made decisions the other party was not informed of." "She may have done this," Caroline said without his full knowledge. "It is possible," Renata said. "I am not saying it happened. I am saying the question is worth asking. And I think you should know that before you decide what the whole story is." Caroline sat with this. The feeling that came was not the one she expected. It was not triumph. It was grief, a complicated, unexpected grief. Because if this was true, if Paige had orchestrated the pregnancy as a strategy, if the announcement at the dinner had been carefully timed and deliberately executed, then Douglas was, in a different way, also a victim of what had happened. And she was not sure how to hold that. She had spent a week being angry at him. The anger had been clean. It had been useful. The anger had given her the energy to make phone calls and read 37 pages of financial documents and tell Dorothy Whitfield she would call her next week. The idea of him also being manipulated complicated the anger in ways she was not ready for. She did not want to feel sympathy for Douglas right now. She had not earned that complexity yet. "I need to think," she said. "I know," Renata said. "Just go," she said. "I will call you." After Renata left, Caroline went upstairs. She went into the narrow closet off the master bedroom. The one she used for off-season clothes, cedar blocks, dry cleaning bags that had never been removed from coats she almost never wore. She sat down on the floor in the dark. She did not turn on the light. Nobody knew she was in there. There was something important about that, about being somewhere that was hers, and that no one could find and that required nothing of her except breathing. She sat in the small, dark quiet for 6 minutes. She counted her own breaths. She did not solve anything. She did not decide anything. She just let the dark be dark and the quiet be quiet, and her breathing slowed down until it was the rhythm of a person who was not quite in a crisis anymore. Then she came out. She picked up the phone. She did not call Douglas. She looked up a phone number. She had to search for it. She found it. She dialed. A receptionist answered in a professional voice. "I would like to make an appointment," Caroline said, "with Dr. Alcott. A consultation, as a new patient." She did not give Douglas's name. She gave her own name, Caroline Whitfield. She needed to understand something. She needed to understand the process. The appointment was for 3 days from now. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen and felt, for the first time in 10 days, that she was moving in a direction she had chosen. Not reacting, choosing. It was a different feeling entirely. 3 days later, Caroline sat in Dr. Fern Alcott's office. The office was calm. That was the first thing she noticed. Warm light from lamps rather than overhead fixtures. A small plant in the corner that was genuinely healthy, which Caroline noted as a detail that said something about the person who worked in this room. A woman who remembered to water a plant was a woman who paid attention to what was alive. Dr. Fern Alcott was 48 years old. She was compact and still in the way of people who have learned to make their presence very intentional. She had the particular steadiness of a person who had sat in this room with many people in very difficult situations and had learned that the room itself needed to hold steady when the person in the chair could not. Caroline sat down. She had prepared what she wanted to say. She had written it in the notebook, in fact, the same notebook where she had written what she wanted, what she owed Griffin, and what she owed herself. "I want to tell you why I am here," she said, "and I want to tell you the truth about it rather than a version of the truth." Dr. Alcott nodded. Caroline told her. The dinner, the announcement, the timeline Renata had identified, the consent question, the specific concern that someone might have used the general framework of an original consent document to authorize a procedure that had not been explicitly consented to at the time it occurred. She did not name names at first. She spoke in the language of hypotheticals. A situation, a friend's situation. She stopped partway through and acknowledged that it was not a friend's situation and finished telling the truth. Dr. Alcott listened without reacting. She was good at listening without reacting. "I cannot speak to any specific case," she said when Caroline finished. "You understand that? What I can speak to are the ethics and the law as they apply to this field generally." "That is what I am asking for," Caroline said. She explained. "In the context of assisted reproduction, consent is layered. A man who provides a genetic sample signs forms at the time of collection. Those forms cover specific uses. They define what can be done with the material and under what circumstances. But a transfer, the actual procedure that results in a pregnancy, requires its own consent at the time of the procedure. A separate step, a separate signature, not an assumed extension of the original consent. So it would be possible," Caroline said carefully, "for someone to have a collection done with full consent, and then at a later time, without the original donor's knowledge or explicit agreement, proceed to a transfer?" Dr. Alcott met her eyes. "It is possible," she said, "for that to occur through a combination of administrative failure and individual decision-making." "Yes, and if that had happened," Caroline said, "the biological paternity would be real." "Yes," Dr. Alcott said. "But the consent to paternity," Caroline said, "in the meaningful sense, would be a different question." In the meaningful sense, Dr. Alcott agreed, it would be a very different question. And increasingly, it is a question that reproductive law is attempting to address. Caroline thanked her. She drove home from the appointment and pulled over on a side street about 6 blocks from the house. She turned the car off. She sat there. She watched a man walk a dog past the window. A yellow lab who stopped to investigate something on the sidewalk while the man waited patiently. She watched a child on a bicycle wobbling along the sidewalk with enormous concentration. "I used to be ordinary," she thought, "and then I thought I had something extraordinary. And then I found out what I had was ordinary but secretly broken. And now I do not know what I have yet, but I am beginning to understand the shape of it." She thought about a child who had not chosen any of this. A child who was going to arrive in the world as the center of a complicated and painful story that she had not authored and could not control. She thought about that child for a long time. Then she drove home. She called Douglas. "Come home," she said. "I need to talk to you, not about us, about Paige." He arrived within the hour. She sat him at the kitchen table, the table where every real conversation in this house happened. She set out the information methodically. The public clinic disclosure, the timeline, the information from Dr. Alcott about the consent protocols, the specific and documented gap between what a general consent covers and what a transfer requires. She watched his face. It changed several times. He had signed forms. He remembered signing them. He had been told at some point in a text message that he still had on his phone that the embryos had been destroyed by mutual decision after the relationship had begun to change. He had believed this. He had allowed himself to believe it because believing it was more comfortable than investigating whether it was true. She told me he started. I know what she told you, Caroline said. I know. Caroline, I did not know she was going to. I know, she said again. She looked at him. I am not doing this because I want to save our marriage, she said. I want you to understand that clearly. I am doing this because you need to know what happened. And because if there is a child coming into the world, that child deserves to have the truth of their origins eventually known and treated honestly. This is not about us. This is about telling the truth. Douglas sat there. He looked, for the first time since all of this began, genuinely small, not managed, not performing remorse. Small in the way of a man who has understood, fully and without the ability to argue himself out of it, what he has done and what has been done around him. I am sorry, he said. I know, she said. I am sorry for all of it, he said. Not just tonight, all of it. The years of it, I know, she said. I need you to go stay at the hotel for a while. We are not done talking. But we are done for tonight, he went. She stood in the kitchen alone. And then she did something she had not done in 3 weeks. She picked up the phone and called her mother. Marta Calloway was 67 years old. She still went to 6 o'clock Mass every morning. She had opinions about everything from the state of Irish-American parishes, to the quality of current television, to the decisions made by any number of public figures she had decided were not to be trusted. She was blunt in the way of women who grew up being told to take up less space and had decided somewhere around the age of 40 that the instruction was wrong and they were going to ignore it. She loved her daughter in the fierce, specific way of a woman who understood what it cost to be a certain kind of person in the world. Caroline called at 8 in the evening. Marta picked up on the first ring, she always did, Mom Caroline said, and then she told her, all of it. From the smell of gardenias at the beginning of the evening to the blue dress she had worn in something like defiance to Douglas's hand, reaching for the water glass to the bathroom floor to the kitchen at 2 in the morning to Renata, and the bourbon and the property filing and the IVF. Timeline and the doctor's office and Douglas sitting at the kitchen table looking small. She told it in order. She told it completely. Her mother did not interrupt once. This was extraordinary. Marta Calloway had never in Caroline's memory gone 3 minutes without interrupting something. She sat in silence on the phone and listened to the entire account without a single interjection. When Caroline finished, there was a pause. Then Marta said, well, I never liked him, Mom Caroline said. You want comfort or you want truth, her mother said. Both, Caroline said. Then here it is, Marta said, in order. First, you are going to be fine, not kind of fine. Not fine in the way people say fine when they mean they are barely holding together. Actually fine. I have watched you handle things that would have broken women with twice your advantages. You are going to be more than fine. Second, she paused. I never liked him, and I need you to know that. Not to say I told you so. I am not doing this to be right. I am doing it because I need you to know that I saw you settle. I watched you choose comfort over clarity for 17 years, and I held my tongue because it was your life, and you seemed, if not happy, then at least content. But I saw it. I saw you make yourself smaller to fit into the shape of what that marriage needed you to be. And I should have said something. I did not. That is on me. It is not on you, Caroline said. Let me finish, Marta said. Third, none of this is your fault, and none of this is your failure. You built a life. Some of what you built was real. Griffin is real. Who you became through those 17 years is real. The work you have done, the person you are, all of that is yours, and it does not disappear because the marriage is ending, Caroline cried. She cried in the way she had not cried since the announcement. Not the controlled, compressed thing she had been doing in bathrooms and closets and parked cars. This was the real thing, the kind that came from the chest, ugly and inarticulate and completely without dignity. Her mother stayed on the line. She did not say anything soothing. She did not say it is okay or let it out or you will feel better in the morning. She just stayed there, present on the other end of the phone, making no noise except the occasional sound of her own breathing. This was its own kind of love, the kind that did not reach for solutions. Caroline slid down until she was sitting on the kitchen floor again, back against the island, knees up, phone pressed against her ear, the same cold tile, a different woman. She cried for about 8 minutes. Then she stopped. Okay, she said. Okay, her mother agreed. I needed that, Caroline said. I know, her mother said. She wiped her face. She got up from the floor. She put the kettle on. Not for coffee, for tea. She did not know exactly why she chose tea instead. It might have been that tea was her mother's preference. It might have been that some part of her knew she needed to do something different from what she had been doing. She found the tea in the back of the pantry, which was now alphabetized. She made a cup. She opened the notebook. She looked at what she had written before. What I want, what I owe Griffin, what I owe myself. She turned to a new page. She wrote for 40 minutes. She wrote about what she had done wrong. Not in the broad self-flagellating way that leads nowhere, but in the specific way that is actually useful. She had known something was wrong for years. She had seen the signs, not the dramatic signs, the obvious ones, but the quieter evidence of a man who was gradually becoming a stranger to her and a life that was slowly becoming a performance. She had talked herself out of what she saw, every time, not because she could not see clearly. She had always seen clearly. That was her gift, and had also been her great failure. She could see clearly, and she had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to interpret what she saw in the most favorable possible light, because seeing it accurately would have required her to act. And she had been more afraid of the act than of the wrong. She wrote that down. Then she read it back. Then she wrote 2 more words underneath it. Not anymore. She closed the notebook. She drank her tea. In the morning, Renata called. Douglas's attorney contacted me last night, she said. He wants to meet. He says Douglas wants to come clean, fully, everything. And he is asking for your help with one specific part of it. My help, Caroline repeated. He is asking whether you would be willing to participate in the process of establishing what actually happened with the IVF procedure, Renata said. His attorney says Douglas has documentation, text messages. He believes there may have been consent fraud involved. He wants to pursue that, Caroline said. He does, Renata said. His attorney is going to pursue it regardless, but he is asking whether you will speak to them, whether you will tell them what you found. Caroline was quiet for a moment. Set up the meeting, she said. Douglas came to the house. He sat across from Caroline and Renata at the kitchen table. His own attorney was on a conference line, present but not visible. The air in the room was the particular air of a situation that had moved past emotion and into process. This was, Caroline recognized, the beginning of something administrative, the administrative dismantling of a marriage. It was strange how much simpler that was than she had expected. Douglas was not the man from the gala. He was not performing. He was not managing. He looked like a person who had arrived at the far end of something and was ready to tell the truth for the first time in a very long time. I want to start, he said, by telling you what I told my attorney. Completely. And I want Renata to hear it, because I owe you the accurate version and I am done giving you edited versions of things. Caroline nodded. He told them. The relationship with Paige had begun 3 years ago, not casually. He had told himself it was casual for about 6 months. After that, he had known it was not casual, and had kept telling himself it was because calling it something real would have required decisions he was not ready to make. He had told himself he was protecting Caroline. He understood now that he had been protecting himself. He had begun discussing the possibility of a future with Paige approximately 18 months ago. That was when he had bought the condo. He had not bought it to have a place to take her. He had bought it as a plan. The plan had been to eventually leave the marriage in a way that was financially fair to Caroline. He had told himself the careful structuring of his assets was protecting her. He understood now, and his attorney had told him directly, that it could be characterized as exactly the opposite. Where does the procedure come in? Renata asked. We agreed to it together, Douglas said, about 18 months ago. She said she wanted children and that her window was not infinite. I agreed to the procedure because I believed it was something we were doing together for our future. He paused. She told me 6 months later that the relationship was moving in a direction she was not sure about. She said she had destroyed the embryos. She said it by text. I believed her because I was already pulling back. I was already beginning to separate from her. I had started to see what the situation actually was. And 2 weeks ago, Caroline said. 2 weeks ago, she told me she was pregnant, he said. She told me the embryos had not been destroyed. She told me she had moved forward with the transfer on her own. She said she had used the general consent document I had signed to authorize the procedure. Did you sign a document that could have authorized that? Renata asked. I signed many documents, he said. I do not know exactly what they covered. My attorney is reviewing them. There are text messages in which she explicitly told me the embryos were gone. My attorney believes that, combined with whatever the original consent documents actually said, there may be a case for consent fraud. Maybe, Renata said. Maybe, he agreed. I am not pursuing this to harm Paige. I want to be clear about that. Why are you pursuing it? Caroline asked. He looked at her directly. Because there is going to be a child, he said, and that child deserves to have the truth of their situation understood by everyone who is going to be part of their life. I do not want to be a father who came into that role through a process I did not fully understand. I want to know what happened. And if someone deceived me, I need that to be established, not for my sake, For the child's sake. The room was quiet. Caroline looked at him. She had stopped needing him to perform anything for her. She was past needing anything from him in that way. But she was able, sitting at this table, to see him clearly, not charitably, not harshly, just clearly. He was a man who had made a series of choices that had compounded into a disaster. He was not a monster. He had been careless and selfish, and willing to deceive himself and her for a very long time. But in this moment, in this specific moment, he was telling the truth. She had not expected to find that, but there it was. "Here is what I want," she said. She had written this in the notebook too. She had written it 3 days ago and had not changed it. "I want a legal separation filed immediately," she said. "I want Renata to represent me. I want you to cooperate fully with the financial disclosure because I have already located the limited liability companies and the retirement accounts, and I will find everything else given enough time and a competent investigator." He nodded. "I want the house," she said, "and I want a settlement that accurately reflects the 17 years I contributed to the building of your professional and public life. The nonprofit connections, the philanthropy network, the social access, all of it. I was not decorative. I was functional, and the settlement should reflect that." He nodded again. "I want you to tell Griffin the truth," she said, "age appropriately, with me in the room. He deserves to understand what happened in terms that are honest without being weaponized. He is 16. He is perceptive. He already knows more than you have told him and less than he suspects. He needs the real version." "I will do that," Douglas said. "I will do it this week, and I want you to pursue the truth about Paige's situation through the appropriate legal and medical channels," she said. "Not because I want her to suffer, not because I think she is simply the other woman, and therefore a villain in this story, but because if there is a child, that child deserves clarity. That child is going to grow up in the middle of something complicated. Every adult around her owes it to her to have told the truth about how she came to be." She paused. "That child did not choose any of this either," she said. "He looked like he might say something then. About the marriage. About whether it was salvageable." She could see it forming on his face, the instinct toward that particular conversation, the hopeful turn of it. "Do not," she said quietly. "Not today. Maybe not ever. But not today." He stood. He shook Renata's hand. He looked at Caroline for a moment. "Thank you," he said. She did not respond to that. There was nothing to say to it. After he left, Renata stayed. They sat together at the table for a while. Neither of them was celebrating. There was nothing to celebrate. There was only the strange, flat quiet of a situation that had moved into a new phase without any fanfare. "Are you okay?" Renata asked. "Starting over feels impossible," Caroline said. "And staying would have felt worse." "Yes," Renata said. "I also think," Caroline said, and she chose her words carefully, "that I needed all of this to happen in exactly the way it happened. I was not going to leave on my own. I had too much invested in the story I had built. I needed the floor to fall out in a way that was completely undeniable. I needed to not be able to argue myself out of what I saw. And now," Renata asked. "Now I cannot argue with anything," Caroline said. "And that is, strangely, a relief." Renata reached across the table and took her hand. They sat that way for a few minutes. Then Caroline walked her to the door. She stood on the front porch after Renata's car had disappeared down the street. The night was cool. The air had the particular smell of autumn on the edge of becoming winter. Dry leaves and cold concrete, and somewhere, a few streets away, someone burning something in a fireplace. She did not go back inside immediately. She stood there in the cool air on her own front porch and she breathed. Just breathed. She was still standing there when she noticed that the lights in Griffin's window upstairs were on. She could see the warm rectangle of it from the porch. He was awake. He was home. The house behind her was hers. She breathed, and then she went inside. 6 weeks later. The house smelled different. She had opened windows she had never thought to open before. She had switched out the candles, the heavy amber ones Douglas had always chosen, for something lighter and simpler. She had started cooking things she liked and he had never cared for. Roasted vegetables with a great deal of garlic, soups that took a long time to prepare. She cooked on Sunday afternoons, and the smell of it filled the house in a way that felt, unexpectedly, like abundance. Small things. She had understood that small things mattered. Griffin was struggling. She would not pretend otherwise. He was angry in the way that teenagers who are also trying very hard not to be angry express their anger, in compressed silences and sudden unexpected moments of real feeling that broke through the armor of his composure. They were having dinner together every night she was home. They were talking more than they had in 2 years. It was not easy. It was exactly what it needed to be. He had started playing guitar again. He had put the guitar down 2 years ago without explanation, and she had not pushed him on it. She understood now that the guitar had come back because something else had left. The performance of normalcy. The energy of a 16-year-old trying to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. She could hear it in the evenings now, coming through his bedroom door. Nothing polished. Just chords and the occasional stumble and the sound of someone finding their way back to something they had always loved. She would stand in the hallway sometimes and just listen. The legal separation had been filed. The settlement negotiations were ongoing. Renata said she was fighting well and that Caroline was going to be fine in the financial sense, which was both practically important and also, Caroline was discovering, not the most important thing. Paige Holloway's situation was in the hands of lawyers and medical ethicists. There had been, as Douglas's attorney had suspected, a discrepancy between the original consent documentation and the procedure that had been performed. Whether it would result in legal action was still being determined. The questions were complicated and the answers were slow. A child was coming, a girl. They knew that now. Caroline had not expected Douglas to tell her, but he had. She had expected to have a reaction to it, but she did. She had spent a great deal of time thinking about this. Not about whether to be angry at Paige, though she had been angry at Paige and would probably continue to be for a long time. Not about whether to be angry at Douglas, though she had been and would likely continue that too, in the quieter, more persistent way of women who have been asked to make themselves small and had complied. She thought about the girl. A child who had not chosen any of this. A child who was going to arrive in the world at the center of a complicated and difficult story. A child who was going to need the adults around her to eventually, over time, become people capable of clarity and honesty and even, impossibly, a certain grace. She had thought about it for a long time. She had landed somewhere that surprised her. She wished the girl well. Not performatively. Not because she was supposed to. Genuinely. In the specific way you wish something well, when you understand that their circumstances are beyond their control, and that the quality of their life is going to depend largely on whether the people around them choose to rise to something difficult. She intended to rise to it, from a distance for now and then, as time made it possible, from whatever strange shared geography came next. She went back to work on a Tuesday. She drove to the nonprofit and parked in her usual spot. She sat in the car for a moment before going inside. Not the way she used to sit and park cars, not frozen, not unable to move, just taking a moment. Gathering herself the way you do before something that matters. Habit, not paralysis. There is a difference. She got out of the car. A woman she did not know well was coming through the building's front door. 30s, perhaps 32 or 33. She was carrying an enormous tote bag on one shoulder and a coffee cup in the hand that was also trying to hold her phone. And she had the look of someone who was managing slightly too many things at slightly too high a speed. She smiled at Caroline as they passed each other. The smile was genuine and also absent. She was already thinking about the next thing. Caroline smiled back. She watched the woman walk down the sidewalk toward wherever she was going. Someday, she thought, that woman might be sitting in her car on a side street she does not know, not sure what her life is. She will be okay too. It was a small thought. It cost nothing. It took about 2 seconds. She went inside. She did her work. Her work was the unglamorous and satisfying business of connecting resources to need, which was what she had been doing for 12 years, without fully recognizing that this was why it mattered to her. It was direct. It was visible. The outcomes were real. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. It had been hers for 12 years, and the marriage had never touched it. That was something. She came home at 6:30. She made dinner. Griffin ate with her and told her about a history assignment that had become more interesting than expected. She asked questions. She listened to the answers. She suggested a book she had read that he might find useful. He looked it up on his phone while they were still at the table, and she watched him read the description and decide he wanted it. She ordered it for him on the spot. He went upstairs. She washed the dishes. She called her mother. "How are you?" Marta asked. Caroline thought about the question. She thought about all the ways she had answered that question in the past year. Fine, and managing and getting through it, and it is complicated, and I do not know yet, and too many things to list. She thought about what was true. "I am mine again," she said. "I do not know exactly what comes next. I am not fully anywhere yet, but I am mine again." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "That will do," Marta said. "That is the whole job." A Friday evening in the 3rd week after going back to work, the Hartley Foundation called. They were planning next year's gala. They wanted Caroline on the planning committee. They asked with the particular warmth of people who had been present at the last gala and had watched her finish her salad. She said yes. She went shopping on a Saturday. She was not looking for anything specific. She went to a department store she had not been inside in several years, a place that had been redone since she last came and felt slightly unfamiliar, which was fine. She wanted slightly unfamiliar. She went through the racks without urgency. She was not looking for red. She was not looking for blue. She was not looking for anything that signified a particular thing. She found something. She was not sure what drew her to it. It was a color she had never worn before, not something she had been avoiding. something she had simply never reached for. She looked at it on the rack for a moment. She took it to the fitting room. She put it on. She stood in front of the mirror. She was 44 years old. She was in the middle of a divorce. Her son was struggling and also beginning, slowly, to not be struggling. Her life was considerably messier than it had been 8 weeks ago. The story of what had happened to her was one she would be telling, in different ways, to different people, for years. She looked at herself. She did not look younger. She did not look like a woman who was performing a second chance at something. She did not look like a before and after photograph. She looked like herself. She looked like the actual specific woman she was, without the weight of performing a version of herself that had been required by a life that was no longer hers. The prison door had been unlocked all along, she thought. I had been my own warden. She stood there a moment longer. Then she bought the dress. She drove home. She carried the shopping bag through the front door and set it on the hall table. The guitar was playing upstairs. Not anything polished. A chord sequence, a pause, the same sequence again, slightly better. Another pause. Then a new phrase, tentative and searching, the sound of someone working out where a song wanted to go. She stood in the hallway. She did not go upstairs. She did not knock on his door. She just stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened to her son playing guitar in his room with the door that he no longer slammed because he was beginning to not need to. The music went on. She stood there and listened. She was not at the beginning of something. She knew that. Beginning was too small a word for what this was. She was not at the end of something either. Endings implied closed doors and closed doors implied finality, and this did not feel final. It felt like a room she had finally entered after standing in the hallway for a very long time. It felt like herself, recognized. She had been the woman in the blue dress finishing her salad while the room looked at her husband. She had been the woman on the cold bathroom floor. She had been the woman in the car in the driveway, and the woman in the dark closet, and the woman weeping on the kitchen floor while her mother stayed silent on the other end of the phone. She had been all of those women. She was all of them still. But she was also the woman who had read 37 pages with a yellow marker. The woman who had called a doctor under her own name. The woman who had told her mother-in-law she would call her next week and meant it. The woman who had sat Douglas Whitfield down at a kitchen table and told him exactly what she wanted in complete and unapologetic sentences. The woman who had stood on her own front porch in the autumn dark and just breathed. The woman who had seen a stranger carrying too many things and thought quietly that the stranger was going to be okay. The woman who had bought a dress in a color she had never worn because she saw it and thought that. Just that. She was that woman now. The guitar went on upstairs. She picked up the shop bag. She went to hang up the new dress. The story did not end with a triumph. It ended with a Tuesday morning and a cup of tea and a son playing guitar and a woman who knew who she was again, which was the only win that had ever actually mattered. It ended with her, standing in her own hallway, listening,